Welcome to this presentation of the St. Augustine Historical Society. Our mission is to acquire, preserve, and interpret the historical influence of St. Augustine and its sphere of influence for the benefit of the public through its stewardship of historic buildings and collections, research, publications, and educational programming. Please consider donating or becoming a member in order to support us in our important mission. Please go to staughs.com and click on the support button. Thank you. Welcome to the Meyer Family, St. Augustine photographers and tin can tourists. This presentation is based on the Meyer photographic collection in the library of the St. Augustine Historical Society. The collection represents the photographic work of Hugo Meyer and his son Ernest A. Meyer and features views of St. Augustine, other parts of Florida, as well as family outings. The photographs were taken between the 1870s and the 1920s. The Meyers did not leave a written legacy to match their photographic collection. What we know about the family is gleaned from newspaper articles, official records, a letter written by a contemporary, and the photographs themselves. So let's get started. Frederick Hugo Meyer was born in 1825 in either Prussia or Switzerland. In 1866, he and his wife Sarah emigrated to the United States, eventually settling in Camden, New Jersey. Their son Ernest may have been born in Europe, but their daughter Jenny was born in the United States, possibly Camden. Hugo is listed in city directories as a cobbler, and an article in a St. Augustine newspaper lists him as a noted lithographer. For a family of photographers, they took few pictures of themselves, nor identified those in their photos they did take. For example, we have no identified photographs of Hugo's wife, Sarah. I am assuming the white-haired gentleman with the guitar is Hugo. Here he poses with his humorous guitar club. Hugo, at this time, would have been about 68 years of age. Here is another image of the guitar club and some of their audience. Here, Hugo is wearing a derby hat and holding his guitar. The humorous aspect seems to include a beer barrel and quantities of adult beverages. As we will see, Hugo's sense of humor was inherited by Ernest as well. When I took a closer look at this photograph, I realized that there were three members of the Meyer family in this picture. The young man with his hands on his hips and gold watch chain was a young Ernest Meyer. The woman standing next to him in Victorian dress was a young Jenny Myers, and the man with the derby hat and guitar is their father Hugo. Ernest Meyer made several self-portraits, and this is one of his most serious ones. Like his father, he had an interesting sense of humor. While researching the family, I found out that in different censuses, he would list his father as being born in different countries. Ernest is listed as being a typographer for various Philadelphia newspapers. A typographer is a person whose job it is to choose the style, arrangement, and appearance of printed letters on a page. The Meyers did not take casual pictures of each other, or at least did not save them for posterity. On the left is an image of Sister Jenny. Jenny was born after Ernest and in 1897 married a man 14 years her senior, David B. Wallace. The Meyer and Wallace families lived in Hugo's house in Camden, New Jersey. After the parents' death, it appears the Wallaces took over ownership of the house. Mr. Wallace is listed variously as a bookbinder and a butler. He died in 1934. The black cat on the right is not named, but for this program, I've named him Tom. He appears in many of the photographs Ernest took during his travels through Florida in the 1920s. The Meyer family visited St. Augustine in 1875, staying through 1877, with Ernest attending the Peabody School during the 1876-1877 school year. They returned in 1882, living in the Moultrie area and in North City until 1884. It appears from a newspaper account that they visited again in 1889. 1875, Hugo and Ernest borrowed a flat-bottomed boat and rowed out into the harbor. The ebb tide soon swept them out to sea. They were spotted by a young man who raised the alarm, and they were rescued by local citizens in the pilot boat. Myers describes what Christmas was like in St. Augustine in 1875. The town celebrated with horse races and various contests. Here, a ham was placed at the top of a greased pole, and various young people vied to be the first to climb the pole and get the ham. Ernest recruited some friends to help him up the pole, and here he is climbing to the top to get the ham. The boys debated what to do with the ham, and they eventually sold it and split the money. In his story, Ernest mentions one of his helpers was a young man whose mother was Aunt Minty, a black cook. We will hear more about Aunt Minty later on in this presentation. This is a sketch Ernest drew from memory of the Peabody School, which he attended in 1875 and 1876. While he says the school was on Avali Street, the name of the street in 1875 was Hospital, after the Spanish military hospital being located on it. It was renamed Avali's because the name hospital was not considered Spanish enough in the 1920s. Here we will see images of St. Augustine taken between 1875 and 1884. While there is no identification of who took these early St. Augustine photographs, I assume they were done by Hugo, though I am sure Ernest was involved and learned how to use the camera at his father's side. This is the Pellissier farm in Moultrie. The building on the right is a log cabin, and the structure on the left is possibly a barn. The family sits in front of their house. Much of Florida, even at this date, was still a frontier. Franklin W. Smith was a Boston hardware merchant with a penchant for making replicas of famous buildings. While most of his creations were on a small scale, he decided to go big after purchasing property in St. Augustine and building a winter residence. His design was inspired by the famed Alhambra Palace in Granada, Spain. The building was one of the first in the U.S. to be constructed from poured concrete. He named it Villa Zoreda after a character in Washington Irving's Tales of the Alhambra. It was completed in 1883 and inspired Henry Flagler to use poured concrete in the two hotels he constructed in St. Augustine. This is Bay Street, now Avenida Menendez, at the corner of Treasury, looking north towards the Castillo de San Marcos, known at this time as Fort Marion. The building on the left is the Vetter Museum. Dr. Vetter was a dentist who opened a natural history museum with various stuffed animals, fish, skeletons, and relics for tourists to occupy their time with, the equivalent of the 1950s roadside attractions. After Vetter's death, it was purchased and run by the St. Augustine Historical and Science Institute. The building and all of its contents were destroyed in a fire in 1914 that consumed a portion of downtown. In 1885, a fire had destroyed a previous Vetter museum on the corner of Bay and the Plaza. As a side note, it appears that Hugo sold his photographs of St. Augustine to various stereo view companies. The Society has a number of stereo views in their collection that are duplicates of Meyer photos. This is a view of St. George Street, looking north from near the plaza. The building with the cross on it is the St. Mary's Convent. In a distance is a group of people standing in front of the Florida Club. The Florida Club was a photographers' cooperative founded by Charles Seaver and Paul Piron. Many stereo views of St. Augustine were the work of this club. Here is another view of St. George Street, further north, looking towards the city gate in the distance. This is the San Marco Hotel, which used to sit about where the parking garage is today. The hotel was 5 stories tall, with 3 mansard roof towers. It was built of longleaf pine and was considered fashionable. It included all modern amenities with the exception of electric lights. Henry Flagler stayed here in the winter of 1885 and considered it one of the most comfortable and best kept hotels in the world. Unlike his previous visit to St. Augustine, the hotel was not filled with consumptives, but rather men of a similar social class to Henry. When he decided to build a world-class hotel in St. Augustine, Flagler hired O.D. Seavey, who was the manager of the San Marco. The hotel continued to operate until it was destroyed by fire in 1897. Its construction of long-leaf pine made it susceptible to fire. In this photo, taken from one of the towers of the San Marco Hotel, we are looking to the south. The dirt road in the foreground is the current-day Orange Street. The house with the porch is the current-day Anne O'Malley's Irish Pub. In the background, the Magnolia and Florida House hotels can be seen. Myers used the towers of the San Marco Hotel as a vantage point to take pictures of St. Augustine. Here he is showing the Castillo de San Marcos, known at this time as Fort Marion. In the foreground is the shell road to St. Augustine, so named because it was paved with oyster shells. There was no bridge across the Matanzas between St. Augustine and Anastasia Island. Directly across the fort are the mudflats at the northern end of Anastasia Island. After filling in with dredged sand, these would become the Davis Shores development. At this time, Anastasia Island was, for the most part, deserted with very little development on it. Tourists would go on short jaunts to the island to enjoy the few attractions. Unlike today, Gilded Agers did not go to the beach, strip down, and soak up the sun. They might visit the beach, but remained fully dressed. They would visit the lighthouse and the nearby alligator exhibit. Visitors to Anastasia Island would get there by a short boat ride and then either ride a horse car or walk to get to their destination. Here, 2 very well-dressed gentlemen are sitting on a log while oysters are being roasted on the fire in front of them. The man with the top hat has an oyster and an oyster knife in his hands. There are shells on the ground in front of them. Also in front of them is a jug with most likely some form of adult beverage. There are 2 gentlemen standing. One holds oysters in his hands, and the other possibly an oyster knife. They are the oyster gatherers and cooks. There was no road to the lighthouse. A horse cart would take you over a causeway that was built through the marshes. After visiting the lighthouse, you could also take a look at the alligator pens that were set up there. For northerners visiting Florida, alligators added a touch of exotic to their trip. This is an example of what the alligator pens would look like at the lighthouse. Visitors would be shocked at the sight of all of these prehistoric-looking creatures in the pens. This is a picture that Ernest Meyer took during his 1920s visit to St. Augustine. When I first saw this photo, I could tell there were people walking on the beach, but I was wondering what else was enjoying the ocean breezes and the water. After enlarging the picture, I discovered there were cows enjoying the beach. In the 2004 video, St. Augustine Remembers, Loretta Cass described how her father, at the turn of the century, would drive his cattle down Bridge Street and across the wood bridge to Anastasia Island so they could graze on the grass there. As I said, Ernest Myers had an interesting sense of humor. If he were alive today, I wouldn't mind sitting down and having a burger and a beer with him. I imagine it would be a fun afternoon. In the back of the family home in Camden, Myers built his playhouse to house all of the things he enjoyed doing it. He documented it in a booklet he called his Playhouse. Here, Ernest is proudly standing in the doorway of his playhouse. It is a substantial two-story brick building behind the house where his family lives. Here, Myers is relaxing in his playhouse. On the desk is a camera he probably uses to take pictures when he is traveling. He has a daybed, a safe, lights at his playhouse. All he needs is a fridge and an 80-inch TV for a modern man cave. Here is the other half of the top floor of his hideaway. Here we see the tools of the trade he uses in developing and printing his pictures. In the back is his dark room of mystery. This is the space he uses to unload his film and place it in the developing bath. Along the back wall are all the chemicals and glasswares needed to develop and print his glass plate negatives. A photographer had to be an amateur chemist in order to develop his pictures. On the table, it appears he is storing his paper and equipment for printing his negatives. To the left is a shelf of reference books. On the right is a guitar, which he may have played in his father's band, and on the daybed, another camera that he uses. Here is the basement of Meyer's playhouse, definitely the working part of the building. In the rear center is a motor with wheels on it to drive belts that power various machines. The motor would power a belt that ran to the ceiling and powered various axles that had wheels on them. You can see the various belts running floor to ceiling. Once the motor was running and the axles turning, the various machines would be powered up. That way, each tool did not need a separate power source. On the right is a bench with tools above it. This is where he would engrave the plates he used to create booklets based on his and his father's photographs. We will see examples of his engravings later in this program. On the left, partway down the side, the round plate is part of a printing press he would use to create prints of his engravings. Tin Can Tourists. Ernest and Jenny Meyer visit St. Augustine in the 1920s. When Ernest Meyer and his sister Jenny visited St. Augustine in the 1920s, they did so in a car. When they first visited St. Augustine in the 1870s, they would take a train to Jacksonville, get on a steamer down the St. Johns River to Tocoi, and grab the creaky little train that went from Tocoi to St. Augustine. Now, using their car, they became tin can tourists. Tourists would drive their cars, and if they were lucky, they would find a wide spot in the road, a field, or an actual camp where they could set up for the night. The Tin Can name came from either the nickname for early cars, Tin Lizzies, or the piles of tin cans the tourists would leave behind after camping for a few days. In West Augustine, there was an area where tourists could set up their auto camps. These were fairly primitive, with cars being draped in canvas to provide a bit of privacy and a dry place to sleep. Having slept in an old canvas tent in my younger days, I know they were hot and smelly. At this camp, like a modern RV resort, tourists from all over would share stories and recommendations about the places to visit and places to avoid. Here are Ernest and Jenny at a quiet camp in a wooded area. The car is covered in canvas. Jenny is cooking on a stove setup, and Ernest is relaxing. Another view of them in camp relaxing. Jenny is watching Tom the cat walk over their car. In his book, Tin Can Tourists in Florida, Nick Wynn uses many Meyer photographs from this period. Many of the pictures in the book show Tom as he traveled around with Ernest and Jenny. Whether Tom found them when they came to Florida or came with them from New Jersey is unknown, like so much about the Meyer family. Another aspect of tin can tourism is living off the land. Buying food from farmers supplemented the tin food that they had with them. Here, Ernest harvests fresh oysters for a meal. Here, Ernest shows off huge blue crabs he netted. Spare time. The Meyer siblings made palmetto brushes. Whether they sold them or took them back as souvenirs is unknown. They worked at it, as evidenced by the brushes hanging over their heads. Here they are using a tool to separate the palmetto leaf into strands that made the bristles for the brushes. Another view of them making brushes. A stripped palmetto sits near Ernest while brushes dangle over his head. They are working in the shade of a tarp attached to their car. Here Jenny and her brother visit the remains of a house on Anastasia Island associated with the nearby coquina quarries, where coquina was quarried for the Castillo de San Marcos and other St. Augustine buildings. Like most tourists, Ernest and Jenny took pictures of the sites they visited. In the next several slides, we see Jenny in front of some of St. Augustine's most iconic sites. Here she is standing in front of the oldest house. Here she is sitting at a fountain at the Fountain of Youth. Unlike today, the grounds were less cared for then. At this time, no one knew the grounds were the location of the original settlement of St. Augustine. Here she is in front of the city gate, with much less traffic than today. Here she is in front of the building that would become the oldest wooden schoolhouse attraction. Here are some of the denizens of the alligator farm. Luckily, Ernest did not get Ginny to stand among them. And here she is sitting on a log. One gets the impression that Ernest kept coming up with different places to stand Jenny, just to see if she would do it. Here she is behind some palmettos. Ernest and Jenny had friends who lived in Moultrie. The family had lived in the Moultrie area for a short time during their earlier visits. Here they are in the woods having an alfresco meal with their friends. There were a number of turpentine camps in the Moultrie area. The pine tree sap would be collected and then taken to a central location where it was distilled into turpentine. Here, Jenny is posing with some pine cones alongside a tree being tapped for its sap. The Ponce de Leon Festival was held from the 1880s through the early 1930s. While it commemorated the discovery of Florida, it was not realistic as Ponce never landed. Later editions of the festival became multi-day pageants celebrating the various time periods of St. Augustine history. In 1924, Meyer photographed the festival, which was held April 8th through the 10th. An article in the St. Augustine Evening Record describes the landing of the Spanish. A replica of a Spanish caravel was built by local boat builders and named Dolores. The arrival in 1924 was delayed when the boat got stuck on a sandbank. It was eventually freed and landed safely. The landing was recreated on the Fort Greene in front of a large crowd. Grandstands capable of holding 4,000 spectators were erected. The pageant recreated important events in St. Augustine history: the founding of St. Augustine, various pirate raids, its time as a British colony, and the transfer of flags from a Spanish colony to a United States territory. Various groups of residents formed to represent the soldiers of different era. The French were portrayed by Hastings residents. One Spanish group was from the Florida School for the Deaf. and another group of St. Augustine residents portrayed both Spanish and English soldiers. Indians were portrayed by members of the Loyal Order of the Moose. The festival was truly a community event. Residents, as British soldiers, portray the period of time Florida was a British colony from 1763 to 1784. Here on the fort green are residents portraying Spanish noblemen. In the background, you can see the grandstands that were erected. A parade was held on April 9th, which went from the city gate through town and returned to the fort green. This band is from Palatka. Elaborately decorated cars were a feature of the parade. Here is one of the floats from the parade. As part of the 1924 festival, a number of organizations decorated cars taking part in the parade. This flower-decorated car represents the benevolent, protective Order of Elks, complete with elk head and antlers on the front of the car. As the parade takes place, Meyer photographs it, as well as two costume participants also taking pictures of the parade. In addition to Meyer's photography, he would engrave and print examples of typography that he had developed, as well as reproducing photographs he and his father took, as well as funny drawings. Here we will see a few of these. This is a view of an early San Sebastian River bridge, circa 1876, looking towards town. The sawmill on the right is identified as Knowlton Sawmill. There were a number of mills and boat builders along the river. In the distance, you see the orange grove owned by Dr. Anderson. St. Augustine produced oranges for most of its history until the frost line moved south in the 1880s and killed many of the trees. The St. Augustine and Tocoy Railroad functioned as an alternative to the water route to St. Augustine. The sandbar at the entrance meant a ship might be trapped outside the harbor for hours or even days until it could safely enter. As an alternative, passengers from Jacksonville would take a steamboat down the St. Johns River to Tocoy and board the train. Here Meyer duplicates an 1885 photo showing the steamboat on the dock and the train ready to carry passengers to St. Augustine. The ride into town was slow, as evidenced by the statement that an engineer was fired for going more than 7 miles per hour. This image shows the St. Augustine depot of the train. If you travel west on King Street just after crossing Route 1, you will see a street named Depot. This is the site of the train station. You would then walk or take a buggy the rest of the way into town. This shows the condition of King Street into St. Augustine. The sandy soil made for a rutted road and bumpy ride into town. The Meyer collection has over 100 of these drawings, where Meyer created various versions of a letter and illustrated it. Meyer drew humorous drawings. Here are the denizens of Herman's Bar, hoping someone will come along and buy them a drink. Tacked on the wall on the right is a sign showing that E. A. Myers is a member of Philadelphia Typographers Union Number 2. Here is another drawing of a bar, though of a higher class than the previous one. Here the jokes are tacked all over the wall, including, if you drive your old man to drink, drive him here. Here Meyer illustrates a limerick penned by Dixon Lanier Merritt in 1910. It was inspired by a postcard sent to Merritt by a reader of his newspaper column. A wise old bird is the pelican. His bill will hold more than his bellican. He can take in his beak enough food for a week, but I'm damned if I see how the hell he can. Aunt Minty is mentioned in several of Meyer's sketches. In 1867, Henry Jackson Morton visited St. Augustine from Philadelphia. Among his many sketches is this image of Aunt Minty and her son. She is surrounded with laundry implements. Here, Meyer illustrates Aunt Minty's house, where she lived with her son Tom. Tom is shown in the image of Christmas in St. Augustine in 1875. He was one of the young men who helped Myers get the ham at the top of the grease pole. Meyer describes Minty as a cook, while in the Morton sketchbook she is shown as a washerwoman. She may have had many jobs trying to make a living for her and her son. Unfortunately, beyond the Morton drawing and the two Meyer sketches, we know nothing else about her. Minty may have been a nickname or misunderstanding of her actual name. No one by that name shows up in the 1870 or 1880 census records. Like many African Americans at this time, her life is a mystery. This image is one of the few showing the interior of an African American dwelling. Here is the drawing of the grease pole, and Tom is shown at the bottom holding the others up. This photo is part of the Myers collection, and it shows a black man living in a hut. Where in Florida this was taken is not known. What is interesting is what happens to this image. While visiting the Cece and Hyatt Brown Museum of Art in Daytona, Florida, I saw this painting and realized it looked just like a Myers photograph. The painting was done by a Miss Beekman of Daytona around 1910. I can only presume that she either saw the original Myers photograph or possibly a stereo view of this image. When comparing the two images, you see they're almost identical. The only difference is that she has changed the trees to palm trees and added a body of water. Otherwise, everything is the same. This Meyer drawing is definitely based on the original photograph of the black man we have previously seen. While he says it is from an old photograph, he has made a number of changes. The person in the drawing is now white. There is a washtub and laundry hanging on the line. Otherwise, the image is identical. So one photograph has inspired two different interpretations. In October of 1948, Ernest Myers and Jenny Wallace move to this house in St. Augustine full time. In December of 1949, Ernest dies. His ashes are scattered in the Matanzas Bay near the Castillo de San Marcos. Jenny Wallace dies on July 3, 1960. She leaves the Meyer collection of photographs and drawings to the St. Augustine Historical Society Research Library. I was curious about what happened to the Myers family home and Ernest's playhouse. This is a picture of the Meyer family home at 412 Mechanic Street, Camden, New Jersey. Ernest Meyer's playhouse was behind the family home. In this Google Earth view, there is nothing left of the Meyer family home or Ernest's playhouse. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation.